All right, diving in today, getting into some really fundamental questions about the mind and the body. And, thinking about our listener out there, the philosopher, you've given us some fascinating material to work with, right? Stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Donald Davidson's Anomalous Monism.
Yeah, this is, I mean, as fundamental as it gets when you start thinking about, like, how our mental lives, our rich inner world, how does that relate to, well, the physical stuff that we're made of, the world around us? It's a big one.
It's a big one. So think of this as a kind of like a joint philosophical inquiry, right? Our mission here, and yours too, listener, is to really get a handle on this theory, anomalous monism. It's incredibly influential. So what are the core claims? Like, what's Davidson really saying? How does he argue for it? What's the logic there? And, where are the kind of sticking points, right? Where are the debates?
Yeah, and we're going to really try to unpack the logic and the implications of this position, especially how it tries to square that intuitive idea we have that, yeah, there's mental stuff going on with this broadly physicalist worldview.
Right, exactly. And it all kind of hinges on these three principles that Davidson lays out. Three core principles, the interaction principle. This is basically the idea that mental events and physical events interact causally. Then there's the cause law principle, which says any cause and effect relationship has to be governed by a strict law. And then there's the really intriguing one, the anomalism principle, which says when it comes to mental events, those strict laws just don't apply. So we're going to unpack these. We're going to see how they kind of build up to Davidson's view.
Yeah, so let's start with that first principle, the interaction principle. Pretty much what it says on the tin, right? Interaction between the mental and the physical.
Yeah.
So, the basic formulation is that some mental events, they causally interact with some physical events. And Davidson often treats this as, like, pretty obvious.
It seems pretty intuitive, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, think about it. You see rain, that's a physical event. It leads to you believing that it's raining, that's a mental event. Or the other way around, you decide to scratch an itch, mental, and then your arm goes up and you scratch it, physical. So, everyday life seems to show this kind of interaction going on all the time.
Yeah, it seems like it has this like gut level plausibility, right?
Right.
But the S&P entry points out that while Davidson often just takes it as obvious, there are reasons behind it and motivations that you see in his other writings. And it's interesting, he initially focuses on these things called propositional attitudes, things like beliefs, desires, intentions, not sensations like pain or tickles. Why do you think he focuses on like the thinking part rather than the feeling part of the mind initially?
Well, the SAPI points out that it has to do with rationality. Propositional attitudes are the kind of mental states that have logical relationships. Beliefs can contradict other beliefs. Desires give you reasons for intentions. Sensations, while they're mental, they don't really play that same kind of rational role. So it's about the sapient mind, the reasoning part, as opposed to just the sentient mind, the feeling part.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the principle talks about physical events. And the essay mentions that Davidson doesn't really like rigidly define what physical means.
Yeah, he kind of leaves it a little bit open-ended. He describes it as being related to this idea of a future complete, and this is key closed system of strict laws.
Yeah.
So it's almost like an idealization, right? Like a placeholder for this super comprehensive physics that we might not even have yet. What's crucial is that these physical descriptions, they have to be the kind of thing that could be part of the strict laws. And that becomes really important later when we get to the anomalism principle and the whole idea that there aren't strict laws involving mental stuff.
Right, because if something's physical, it should, at least in principle, be describable in a way that could fit into these really strict, exceptionless laws, right? Now, the events themselves, the things that are interacting. The SB points out that Davidson actually changed his mind about how you decide if two descriptions of an event are really talking about the same event.
Right. So early on, he was leaning towards what you could call a causal criterion. Two descriptions picked out the same event if they had all the same causes and all the same effects. But later, he moved to a spatiotemporal criterion. If they occupy the exact same space and time, then it's the same event, even if the descriptions are different. But the essay makes it clear that this change doesn't really affect anomalous monism.
So it's like the event is the concrete happening and mental or physical is just a way of describing it, right?
Exactly. Think of it like flipping a light switch. You can describe it as, flipping the switch or the room lighting up. Different descriptions, but potentially the same event.
Right, right. Okay. And then there's this interesting thing. For the sake of argument, Davidson just assumes that all mental events interact causally with physical events, even though the principle itself only says some do. Why make that stronger assumption?
It's like he's setting a higher bar for himself.
Yeah.
If even the mental events that don't have obvious physical causes or effects still end up being token identical to physical events, which is where his theory goes, then his conclusion becomes even stronger.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so we have this interaction. Now, the CP brings up a really important distinction. Causality is extensional, but explanation is intentional. What does that mean, and why is it important for anomalous monism?
This is super key to understanding Davidson. Causality being extensional means it just holds between events, regardless of how we describe them. If A causes B, that's true whether we call A the loud bang or the backfiring engine, and whether we call B the startled jump or the muscle contraction. But explanation is different. It's intentional. It depends on how we describe the events. To say that the most significant event of the day caused a power outage might be true, but it doesn't really explain the outage in a way that helps us understand right.
Right, we need the right descriptions, the ones that actually connect in a meaningful way, like the lightning strike caused the power surge, which caused the outage. That actually explains it.
Exactly. And this is going to be really important when we talk about how mental events can be causes without being governed by strict laws at the level of description. Because, the objective fact of what happened is different from how we understand it and the descriptions we use in that understanding.
Right, right. Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us to the second principle, the cause law principle. What's the core idea here?
So the cause law principle says that whenever you have a cause and effect relationship between events, there's always a strict law governing it. So, if mental event M causes physical event P, or the other way around, there's got to be a strict law that covers that interaction.
And the SP tells us that Davidson, at first, he just kind of assumed this principle. But later on, he tried to justify it. But before we get into those justifications, what exactly does he mean by strict laws? That seems like a key thing to nail down.
Yeah, absolutely. So a strict law, the way he means it, it's basically a law where if you have the complete set of antecedent conditions, they absolutely guarantee the consequent. Classically, that's been understood in deterministic terms. If A, then B, no matter what. But Davidson, he's open to the idea of strict indeterministic laws too. The key thing is that the antecedent conditions, they have to be complete. They include everything relevant that could prevent the effect from happening. So even if the outcome isn't absolutely certain, a strict law would still tell you exactly what the probabilities are for each possible outcome. It's about how comprehensive the conditions in the law are, not just about whether the outcome is guaranteed.
So it's about accounting for everything relevant, even if it only determines a probability and not a certainty.
Exactly.
And this cause law principle, it applies not just to like laws where the cause comes before the effect, those laws of succession, but also to what they call bridge laws, right? Laws that would correlate simultaneous mental and physical properties. Like whenever you have brain state X, you also have mental state Y at the same time.
Exactly. And remember, as we'll see later with the anomalism principle, Davidson denies that there are any strict laws that involve mental predicates. Whether they're purely mental laws, purely psychophysical laws, or laws with mental stuff in either the antecedent or the consequent, that's what creates the really interesting tension and leads to all the debate.
Right. So no strict laws linking mental and physical states directly as types.
Right.
And the SLT mentions that this denial of strict laws involving the mental, it's still compatible with what are called hedged generalizations. Those are generalizations that have a ceteris paribus clause, all other things being equal or under normal conditions. So we might say ceteris paribus when someone intends to raise their arm, they do raise their arm. But we can't fully spell out all the other things being equal when it comes to the mind.
Exactly. The idea is that you can't translate those ceteris paribus clauses, the ones that apply to psychological stuff, into a finite set of really precise physical conditions that would then turn those generalizations into strict exceptionless laws. They're always going to be open-ended and context-dependent.
Okay, so that's the cause law principle and what these strict laws mean. Now, what about Davidson's attempts to justify this principle? The SC points to this connection he tries to make between how we understand physical objects, physical events, and the idea of laws in general.
Right. So he's arguing that the very concept of a physical object, like what it means for something to be a physical object, is tied up with the idea of laws. It's an object whose changes are governed by laws. To illustrate this, he looks at this philosopher, C.J. Ducasse, who tried to define singular causation, like a single instance of cause and effect, without appealing to any general laws. Ducasse's idea was that an event C causes an effect E if C was the only change in E's immediate environment right before E happened.
So he was trying to ground causation in that specific situation without needing broader laws.
Exactly. But Davidson pushes back on this. He says, okay, what do we even mean by change if we don't have some background idea of regularity or law-like behavior?
Mm.
To identify a change, you have to have a change of predicate. Something gains or loses a property. And that gets you thinking about, well, which predicates are the right ones to use, the ones that actually capture real changes and can be part of laws. He also points out that our understanding of change itself has evolved along with scientific theories, which suggests there are these theoretical principles, which are basically laws, underlying it all.
So even identifying a cause kind of assumes some background understanding of laws or regularities, right?
Yeah.
He also brings in Goodman's GRU problem here, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
Yeah.
He argues that the predicates we use to describe change, they have to be projectable, the kind that you can use for induction and scientific explanation. And Goodman's whole thing with GRU, which is green before a certain time and blue after, it shows that you can't just assume which predicates are projectable. For Davidson, that notion of projectability is deeply connected to the idea of laws.
But even if we grant that, the gas brings up a good point. Even if change presupposes laws in some sense, why does it have to be strict, exceptionless laws? Why not just ceteris paribus laws with that all other things being equal clause?
That's the million-dollar question. And the ASEP admits that Davidson's defense of the strictness requirement is not as strong as it could be. He does talk about dispositional predicates too, like calling glass fragile. Those are defined by how they tend to behave under certain conditions. And he suggests that they always have this implicit ceteris paribus clause, which hints at underlying strict laws. But again, the argument for those laws being strictly exceptionless isn't totally convincing.
So the cause law principle, while central to his whole framework, might be resting on a bit of a shaky foundation. Now, what are some other objections that philosophers have raised about it?
One big one, going back to Hume, is that we use the word cause all the time without assuming these strict laws. We say smoking causes cancer, even though not every smoker gets cancer. Davidson's response is that, well, our everyday talk about causes might be a bit loose, but there might still be a strict law, maybe in a more scientific vocabulary, that covers that particular case.
So our everyday talk is kind of rough, but there's a strict law behind the scenes. And then there's the fact that we don't actually know any true predictive strict laws, at least not in that exceptionless sense.
Right. If we can't point to any examples, it makes the whole principle seem very abstract. And then you have quantum mechanics, which seems to suggest that the universe is fundamentally indeterministic at the micro level. Doesn't that contradict the idea of strict laws governing everything?
But doesn't Davidson have a response to that? Something about strict laws being able to be indeterministic.
Yeah, he says that a strict law can still be indeterministic. It would just specify the exact probabilities of different outcomes given the conditions. So quantum indeterminism doesn't automatically rule out the cause law principle, as long as those probabilistic laws are themselves strict, meaning they have all the conditions fully specified.
Okay, so even with some randomness, you can still have strict laws in that sense.
Right. And then the SP mentions an objection from John McDowell, which connects to Davidson's rejection of the dualism of scheme and content. Basically, the idea that there's this hard separation between our conceptual frameworks and the world itself.
Right.
McDowell argues that if Davidson's rejecting that kind of dualism, then the cause law principle, which seems to impose this strong structure on how the world has to work causally, is less motivated. McDowell doesn't see the need for such a strong principle if you're going for a minimal and plausible kind of materialism.
Interesting. So even within Davidson's own system, there are tensions and challenges to that principle. All right, let's move on to the third principle, the really distinctive one, the anomalism principle. What's the core claim here?
This is where things get interesting. The anomalism principle says that there are no strict laws that can be used to predict or explain mental events, or that mental events can be used to predict or explain other events. Basically, the mind isn't governed by the same kind of strict laws that supposedly govern the physical world, according to the cause law principle.
And the SOP mentions that people who support this idea, they often point to features of mental properties that are supposed to make them really different from physical properties. And these differences are supposed to create this kind of incompatibility that makes strict laws linking them impossible. What are some of those features?
There are a few key ones. One is the idea of holism. This is the idea that mental states, they're all interconnected. A single belief, for example, only gets its meaning from its place in a whole web of other beliefs and desires. This is without limit, as Davidson puts it. You can't just reduce mental states to physical states without bringing in all this mental baggage.
So understanding a belief requires understanding a whole bunch of other beliefs and desires, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's supposed to show why you shouldn't expect to find strict laws neatly connecting mental and physical stuff.
Right. And then there's that idea of rationality playing a key role in our thoughts and actions, which is seen as very different from the kind of descriptive laws that govern the physical world.
Right. It's the ought versus the eyes. And that creates a fundamental mismatch, supposedly.
So initially, this principle was mainly about ruling out strict laws that predicted mental events based on physical events. But then it expanded to deny any strict law with mental predicates at all, right? Including those bridge laws that would try to directly correlate mental and physical properties.
Exactly. So it's not just that we can't predict beliefs from brain states. It's also that we can't even say, like, this type of belief is identical to this type of brain state. It rules out type identity theories. And remember, the interaction principle, by saying there are causal links, already rules out strict laws that are purely mental, because the mental is always open to influence from the physical.
Right. So no strict laws just between mental states, no strict laws directly linking mental and physical types, and no strict laws reliably predicting one from the other. That's a pretty strong claim.
It is.
The SCP then gets into specific arguments for this anomalism principle, starting with arguments from holism and indeterminacy. So the holism argument, as we talked about, it emphasizes that interconnectedness of mental states. Davidson even said this interconnectedness is without limit. It's like you can't define a single mental state without bringing in a whole network of other mental states. And he suggests that this is a big reason why you shouldn't expect these strict laws linking the mental and the physical.
Yeah. The idea is that a belief only makes sense, it only has meaning, in the context of a whole bunch of other beliefs and desires.
But the SUPI does point out that just because it's hard to define mental states in terms of physical states, it doesn't mean there can't be any law-like connections between them. We need a clearer explanation of why this reduction is actually impossible.
Right. And then there's this period where Davidson was kind of flirting with Quine's idea of the indeterminacy of translation.
Right. What was that all about?
The idea was that you could have multiple ways of interpreting meaning and mental states that all fit the evidence, but they're incompatible with each other. So the same physical facts could be explained by different conflicting mental state assignments.
So the physical facts don't nail down the mental facts in a unique way.
Exactly. And that would make it hard to have strict laws that could reliably predict mental states from physical states.
But the set points out some problems with this. First, even if that indeterminacy were true, it wouldn't rule out all psychophysical laws. Like, it wouldn't rule out laws saying that certain mental states reliably cause certain physical events.
Right. And also, Davidson himself later backed away from the strong version of indeterminacy. He started seeing it more as a kind of notational variance, like different ways of describing the same underlying reality, not a deep difference in what actually exists.
So it's like different labels for the same thing.
Yeah. And he came to think that anomalism would probably be true even if strong indeterminacy wasn't.
Okay, so that leads us to what seems like a more central argument for anomalism. The argument's based on rationality. And this brings in the principle of charity, right?
Right, the principle of charity. This is the idea that when we're trying to understand other people's minds, when we're interpreting their behavior, we have to assume that they're mostly rational. We have to make their beliefs seem consistent, mostly true, and their desires aimed at what they see as good. And Davidson argues that this principle is not just a helpful tool, it's actually constitutive of what it means to understand someone's mind.
It's a necessary part of the process.
Exactly. And this is where rationality ties into anomalism, because interpretation is ongoing, always open to revision as we get new evidence. And guided by this ideal of rationality, Davidson says there can't be these tight, law-like connections between the mental and the physical. Each realm has its own proper source of evidence, as he puts it. So, understanding minds is this normative thing guided by principles of rationality, whereas understanding the physical world is more about describing brute facts.
Right. So there's this fundamental difference in how we come to know about the mind versus how we come to know about the physical world. And the SAP then gets into Jae-Gwon Kim's take on this, focusing on the distinction between normative and descriptive principles.
Kim's argument is that if there were strict psychophysical laws, then the contingent nature of the physical world would end up contaminating the necessity of rational principles. So you have a principle like, if you believe P and believe that P implies Q, then you should believe Q.
That seems pretty logically necessary, right?
Right. But Kim's point is, If we had strict laws linking those beliefs to specific brain states, then a contingent physical law could, through those links, seem to explain that rational principle, which shouldn't be explainable that way. It undermines its status as a necessary truth.
Interesting. So the contingency of the physical world would kind of infect the necessity of the rational world.
Exactly. But the essay does point out that Kim might be relying on too sharp a distinction between strict and ceteris paribus laws and between the normative and the descriptive. Davidson allows for ceteris paribus laws with mental predicates, and he sees a normative dimension even in our understanding of the physical world.
Right, so that strict separation that Hume relies on, it might not be so clear-cut. Okay, then we have John McDowell's take on the rationality arguments. He focuses on this idea of an ideal of rationality and the uncodifiability of rational norms.
Right. McDowell says that rationality isn't just about logic. It's about broader principles governing action and belief, like acting on all the evidence you have or acting according to your best judgment. And he says our very understanding of rationality, it evolves over time. It can be refined. It can be corrected. So you can't just capture it in some fixed set of rules that would fit into strict laws. This uncodifiability, as he calls it, is why we shouldn't expect strict laws connecting mental and physical stuff.
So our conception of rationality is dynamic, always changing, which is different from how we think of physical laws, right? But the SAP does raise some questions here too. Isn't this uncodifiability a bit too general? Our understanding of physical concepts changes over time too as we get new evidence and new theories?
That's true. And the SAP also points out that McDowell focuses more on how the standards of rationality themselves evolve, whereas Davidson is often talking about how new evidence leads us to reinterpret mental states based on the same principles of charity.
Right, different emphasis there. And then within the rationality arguments, there's also the context and complexity argument.
Right? This is the argument from McDowell and Martin Child. They emphasize that the way we understand people in everyday life, it's more about rules of thumb that need a lot of contextual information. They're not like universal strict laws. And they say this complexity and context dependence of psychology, it just makes it unsuitable for strict laws. They also point to the fact that people don't have fixed universal goals or values when they make choices or form beliefs. So generalizations about psychology will always be incomplete and context sensitive.
So understanding people is about interpretation, not just applying rigid rules.
Exactly. But the CP pushes back on this too. They say that strict laws in physics often have to take into account lots of factors too. It's not like they're always simple. And they argue that you could, in theory, include all those contextual goals and values in the antecedent conditions of a strict law, even if it would make the law super complex.
So it's not clear that psychology is inherently more complex than physics in a way that would rule out strict laws. Okay, so that covers the rationality arguments. The SC then moves to a different kind of argument for anomalism, the causal definition argument.
Right. This one shifts the focus away from rationality and towards how mental states and events are defined. They're defined at least partly by their typical causes and effects. Davidson himself said that reasons explain actions by causing them. And he later developed this idea that mental states are partly individuated by their causal roles. So psychological explanations are basically causal explanations that use concepts that are themselves defined causally. And he also talks about how causal concepts in general are anomic, meaning lawless. We pick out causes based on our interests and what we're trying to explain.
So it's not about finding some complete law-governed picture of all the physical processes involved. It's about picking out what's relevant for our purposes.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with what he calls ultimate physical explanations, which he thinks are not interest relative in the same way. Physics, for him, is about finding a complete and law-governed description of the world, independent of our particular needs.
Interesting. So mental concepts are tailored for understanding agency and reasons, and that makes them unsuitable for strict laws. But the SE points out a problem here. If this interest relativity is the key, then why is psychology so different from other special sciences, like biology or chemistry? They use interest relative explanations too. So why is rationality still the basis for anomalism?
The SCP suggests that the causal definition of mental states might explain why they're anomic, but rationality might be more about explaining why we continue to use those anomic concepts, because they're good for understanding intentional action and giving rationalizing explanations for what people do. So rationality is maybe more about why we take mental states seriously, not so much about their lawlessness itself.
Okay, that's a helpful distinction. So we've gone through the three core principles and the arguments surrounding them. Now we get to the big conclusion that Davidson draws from all of this. Monism, specifically token identity.
Right. So if you buy the interaction principle that mental and physical events interact causally, and the cause law principle that all causation is governed by strict laws, and the anomalism principle that there are no strict laws involving mental stuff, then Davidson says it follows logically that any mental event that's a cause or an effect has to be identical to some physical event.
It's like he's squeezing the conclusion out of those three principles.
Yeah, it's like a logical puzzle. Mental events are causes and effects, so they have to fall under strict laws. But they can't fall under strict laws as mental events, so they have to be something else that can fall under those laws, and that something else is a physical event.
And it's important to remember that this is about the ontology of events, the specific happenings in the world, not about substances like mind and body in the traditional
Right,
sense.
it's not about whether the mind is a separate substance. It's about the nature of individual events and how they're described.
And that brings us to token identity. The idea that each instance of a mental event, like me understanding what you're saying right now, is identical to some specific physical event happening in my brain.
Exactly. And it's not saying that all beliefs are identical to all brain states of a certain type. That would be type identity, which he rejects.
Right, right. So how does this token identity actually follow from those three principles?
So the interaction principle says there are causal links. The cause law principle says there have to be strict laws for those links. And the anomalism principle says there can't be strict laws involving mental descriptions. So for a mental event to be part of a causal relationship governed by a strict law, it has to also have some non-mental property that can be in that law. And then given this idea of the causal closure of the physical world, the idea that every physical event has a complete physical cause, Davidson concludes that those non-mental properties have to be physical properties.
But the set brings up a challenge here. How do we get from non-mental strict law properties to physical properties without assuming causal closure already? Why couldn't those properties be from some other science, like biology or chemistry? They might have strict laws too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the ASEP acknowledges that Davidson's argument could be clearer there. But it does mention an interpretation by Scott Yalowitz, who tries to derive causal closure from the three principles, and the idea that only physical properties aren't defined in terms of their causal roles.
Okay, interesting. So token identity, the way Davidson sees it, is different from older identity theories. It's not based on finding empirical correlations between mental and physical types. It's based on the lack of those correlations.
Exactly. It's an a priori argument.
Yeah.
The impossibility of those type identity laws is what leads to the conclusion of token identity.
And the ASEP mentions a shift in how Davidson thought about this later on. He moved away from the idea that each mental event has to be uniquely picked out by a very specific physical description that fits perfectly into a strict law.
Right. He realized that strict laws in physics probably cover much broader areas and use more general descriptions. So the focus became that some physical description applies to each mental event, not that we need a super precise, unique physical description for each one.
Okay, that's a subtle but important point. Now, of course, there are objections to this token identity idea. One is that mental events, they don't seem to have the same kind of location or definiteness as physical events. Like, how can you say a fleeting thought is identical to some specific neurons firing?
Right. Critics say it seems arbitrary to try to match up complex mental processes with specific brain events.
And they argue that any evidence we find for token identity would have to rely on at least some type-level correlations.
Right.
But Davidson has some responses, right?
Yeah, he says that the argument is a priori, so we already have reason to think that mental events have some physical property, even if we don't know what it is yet. And the fact that we don't experience mental events as having precise locations doesn't mean they don't have them at a more fundamental level. We might just not be able to access that level yet.
So it's a metaphysical claim, not an epistemological one.
Exactly. And he's also open to the idea of ceteris paribus correlations between mental and physical stuff, which can help with the evidence problem without undermining the basic identity claim.
Okay, so that's token identity. Now, what about supervenience? How does that fit into the picture?
So supervenience in this context means that you can't have a difference in mental properties without a difference in physical properties. If two events are physically identical, they have to be mentally identical too. It's a way of capturing the dependence of the mental on the physical without saying that the mental reduces to the physical. And Davidson specifically talks about weak supervenience, meaning this dependence holds within a possible world, but not necessarily across all possible worlds.
Right, so the same physical state could maybe have different mental correlates in different possible worlds.
Exactly. But here's the problem. Doesn't this clash with the anomalism principle? If mental properties are so tightly linked to physical properties, shouldn't there be some kind of strict law connecting them?
Yeah, that seems like a major tension. If mental properties are determined by physical properties, there should be a law describing that, right? Even if it's super complex.
Right. Davidson first tried to argue that supervenience actually follows from anomalous monism, but not many people buy that. Later, he said they're at least consistent with each other. But even his reformulation of supervenience, which is that if two events differ mentally, they must also differ physically, it still seems to imply some kind of law-like regularity.
So there's still this tension between supervenience and anomalism, and the SP points out that some attempts to reconcile them, like saying the laws would be too complex for us to know, they kind of weaken anomalism. They turn it from a metaphysical claim about there being no laws to an epistemological claim about us not being able to know them. And the SEPI mentions this other idea from Davidson that maybe the supervenience relations themselves are ceteris paribus. Maybe that's a way to have dependence without strict laws.
Yeah, that's a possibility. It's not been explored that much, but it's worth considering.
Okay, so that's supervenience. And that brings us to the big, scary objection, epiphenomenalism. If mental events are just identical to physical events, and the physical world is causally closed, does that mean our thoughts and feelings don't actually do anything?
This is a huge worry. If everything that happens has a complete physical explanation, what role is left for the mental? Some people bite the bullet and embrace epiphenomenalism. They say mental events might offer a different kind of explanation, even if they're not causally effective. But a lot of people see it as a deal breaker. It makes mental talk seem like an illusion, irrelevant to what's really happening.
Right. And the ESSA lays out some of the arguments against Davidson on this. They say even if mental events are causes because of their physical properties, what about mental properties themselves? Do they explain anything? If explanation requires laws and there are no psychophysical laws, then mental properties can't explain anything.
Right. And Davidson's response is partly that he allows for ceteris paribus laws.
Hmm.
Maybe those were enough for explanation. He also appeals to supervenience, saying mental properties can still make a difference to what happens by influencing the underlying physical properties.
But the ESSA points out that this seems backwards. Usually the physical is supposed to explain the mental, not the other way around, and a strong enough supervenience relation might end up implying strict laws anyway.